Section 1. The world that made a monster. There is a name, just a name really at first. A collection of syllables that on its surface sounds almost ridiculous. Guttural and heavy, like gravel rolling around inside a metal drum. But when that name reaches the ears of someone who knows what it means, who has read the intelligence assessments and studied the casualty reports and looked at the satellite imagery of what used to be a functioning hive city before it became a crater full of scrap metal and greenskin spore, the reaction is something very specific. Not panic exactly. Panic is loud and visible and has movement in it. This is quieter. It is a kind of stillness that falls over a room like cold water. The kind that tells you that whatever is coming is not simply an enemy. It is a category of problem that sits outside the frameworks you usually use to understand problems. The name is Ghazghkull. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the beast of Armageddon, the prophet of the green gods. The warlord of warlords. His full name, spoken in its entirety, rolls through several syllables that encode something of his history, his origin, his self-understanding, and the terrible gravity of what he represents. Ghazghkull, the personal name, used by those who know him, which is a very small number of beings, considering that knowing him in any personal sense is statistically likely to be one of the last experiences you have. Maguruk, a marker of origin, a reference to the planet Urk where his story began, though the connection is worn smooth by time and use into something more like a surname than a meaningful geographic descriptor. Thraka, a word in the Orc language that carries connotations of domination, of absolute supremacy, of a status so unambiguously above everyone else that the word itself functions as both noun and proof of claim. The name in full is a sentence, a boast, a declaration of what this creature believes itself to be. And the genuinely alarming thing, considered from a sober and careful distance, is that the evidence mostly supports the claim. Before we go into the campaigns and the invasions and the rivalries and the deaths and the resurrections, and yes, plural deaths, plural resurrections, which is a thing that apparently happens in this universe to beings operating on Ghazghkull's particular frequency, we need to start at the beginning, not at the moment of his first great conquest, not at the first time the Imperium learned the name and understood what it meant. We need to go back to something much more modest and much more specific. We need to understand the world that produced him and the accident that transformed him from an unremarkable piece of the Orc military ecosystem into something the galaxy had never quite seen before. We need to go to Urk. Urk was, in the grand astronomical catalog of the Imperium and the broader map of the 41st millennium, the kind of world that barely merited a footnote. It was an Orc world, which means it had been an Orc world for as long as anyone had been keeping records about it. The original biosphere so thoroughly transformed by the invasive Orcoid ecosystem that whatever had existed before the Greenskins arrived was essentially a memory nobody bothered to recover. The surface was a characteristic Orc landscape, rough, industrial, in the way that Orc settlements are industrial, covered in the accumulated scrap and construction and fungal growth that defines anywhere Orcs settle in significant numbers. The sky on a typical day had the color of old smoke. The air carried the smell of metal shavings and the particular organic richness that comes from large-scale fungal cultivation, which is not a smell you get used to quickly if you were not born into it. Life on Urk, if you were an Orc, proceeded along lines that would be familiar to any Orc on any world across the galaxy. You were born from the ground, which is the Orc way, spores rather than conventional reproduction, a biological quirk that turns out to be one of the most important facts about the species when you think about it for any length of time. But we will come back to that. You grew, you fought some more. If you were strong and clever enough to survive, you grew larger, and the larger you grew, the more fights you won. And the more fights you won, the more you ate, and the faster you grew. And eventually you were large enough that other Orcs respected you. And if you were very large and very successful, you might end up running a tribe. And if you were extraordinary in some way, you might become a war boss with real authority over a significant patch of your world. Most Orcs never get past being ordinary soldiers in someone else's warband. The distribution of outcomes in Orc society is extremely skewed. A few war bosses at the top, commanding the loyalty and the muscle of enormous numbers of ordinary Orc boys who live and die in their service. At any given time on Urk, the dominant figure was a Death Skull's war boss named Dregmek, who held his position through the conventional mechanisms of orc authority. He was big, he was violent, he was willing to fight anyone who questioned his right to be in charge, and he had surrounded himself with enough powerful lieutenants to make any challenge extremely costly. Under him, the various tribes and clans of Urk fought, raided, competed over resources, and occasionally turned their collective attention outward toward targets beyond their world when a particularly ambitious campaign presented itself. Into this world was born the orc, who would eventually be called Ghazghkull. At this early stage, he was simply another newly spawned orc boy, small and unremarkable, taking his place at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy that defined everything on Urk. There is nothing in the historical record, or in Makari's later testimony, which represents the most detailed and internally consistent account of Ghazghkull's early life that exists, that identifies him as exceptional at this stage. He was not larger than average for a young orc. He had not demonstrated any particular aptitude for the violence that defines orc social advancement. He was, in the most literal sense, nobody. This is worth emphasizing, because it is easy when looking at where things end up to read destiny back into the beginnings. To imagine that there was always something visible, some early sign that this particular greenskin was different from all the others spawned around the same time on the same world. The record does not support that narrative. Ghazghkull's story does not begin with an exceptional youth. It begins with a very average one, and then with an event that was not destiny, but accident. Not divine arrangement, but simple, terrible luck. The accident changed everything. But it was an accident. The Space Marines came to Urk. The precise chapter responsible is one of those details that the historical record has been frustratingly slow to confirm. Some sources, including certain lexiconum entries and intelligence assessments assembled after the fact, point to the Dark Angels. Other accounts are less specific, referring simply to Space Marines of an unknown chapter. What can be said with confidence is that a force of Astartes had, at some point before the events that matter to our story, established a presence on Urk, a command sanctum, a forward operating base, the kind of installation that a Space Marine chapter might maintain in a location of strategic surveillance interest, built in a defensible location and designed to operate for extended periods without requiring regular resupply. The base was positioned on a remote mountain crag, which speaks to both the tactical thinking of whoever sited it and to the natural assumption that an orc population would not bother scaling a difficult mountain just to attack something that was not obviously worth attacking. This assumption was, in its own way, a misunderstanding of the orc nature. Orcs climb mountains. They climb them for the same reason they do most things, because there is something up there and they have not fought it yet. The automated defenses left behind when the Space Marines withdrew from the base were, in theory, sufficient to deter any investigation. In practice, they functioned as a kind of invitation, because the thing orcs find least resistible is evidence that something on the other side of an obstacle does not want them coming through. The attack on the automated defenses was not a serious military operation. It was closer to what you might call recreational raiding, a group of orc boys following their natural instinct to hit anything that could be hit, acquiring resources that could be looted, doing the thing that orcs always do when presented with the option. The automated systems responded to the incursion with the precision they had been programmed with, and a bolter shell found the skull of a specific young orc boy, not a graze, not a wound that a field surgeon could straightforwardly address, clean and bandage, and send the patient back into rotation. A full direct impact from a weapon that routinely penetrated ceramite battle armor, a shot that destroyed approximately 30% of the cranial structure, and reduced a substantial portion of the brain tissue beneath to something that had no further function in any biological sense. By any reasonable assessment, this was a death, not a dramatic, heroic death, just one more orc boy killed by automated defenses in a skirmish too small to generate paperwork. His remains to be processed by the same biological mechanisms that converted dead orcs into the spore cloud that sustained the next generation. He did not die. He was found in the chaos following the defense system's response by someone who would have a claim to being the second most important figure in this entire story, a pain boy who operated in the area, whose reputation among the orcs of Urk was built on equal parts genuine surgical skill and the specific kind of dangerous creativity that makes other orcs keep their distance when he has that particular expression on his face. Mad Doc Grotznik. The name should be spoken with a certain respect, if an unsettled one. Ghazghkull is, in the technical taxonomy of orc society, an orc pain boy, the greenskin equivalent of a combat medic and field surgeon, a role that in human military organizations comes with extensive training, clear ethical guidelines, and institutional support structures designed to make the work as safe and effective as possible. In orc society, it comes with a collection of rusty tools, a strong stomach, and the belief that the best way to learn how something works is to take it apart and see whether you can put it back together. Pain boys in orc culture occupy a strange social position. They are necessary. Fighting species require someone who can repair fighters. But they are also deeply, consistently frightening in ways that even the most battle-hardened orc tends to find uncomfortable. There is something about a being who views your body primarily as an interesting engineering problem that produces unease in creatures not normally capable of unease. Ghazghkull was, even by the standards of his profession, exceptional. He had been operating longer than most of his patients had been alive. He had developed techniques that went well beyond the baseline of orc medical practice. More sophisticated bionic installations, more complex surgical procedures, a collection of theoretical frameworks about how the orc body worked and what could be done to it that he had assembled through the simple expedient of doing a great many things to a great many patients and observing the results. He was also, it should be said, genuinely insane in ways that went beyond the professional standards of his calling. The boundary between healing and experimentation was, for Ghazghkull, essentially invisible. He looked at the young orc boy with the destroyed skull, and he saw the most interesting thing he had encountered in a very long time. The surgery that followed involved the removal of the damaged brain matter, the careful reconstruction of what remained, and, the crucial element, the thing that would turn an act of surgical improvisation into the origin point of a galaxy-altering chain of events. The replacement of the missing cranial section with a plate of adamantium. Adamantium is, in the material hierarchy of the 41st millennium, among the hardest and most durable substances known. It is used in the construction of Terminator armor, in the most heavily armored vehicles in the Imperial arsenal, in the structures designed to survive the most extreme conditions that existence in this universe can produce. Ghazghkull apparently sourced his from the rear armor plate of a Terminator suit. An act of creative resource utilization that is, when you think about it, rather typical. The surgery was extraordinary. It was also, apparently, not quite successful, in that the patient died on the table. Ghazghkull, with the pragmatism of his profession and the particular indifference to individual outcomes that characterized his approach to medical work, disposed of the body in the waste area behind his shed. And there the story might have ended, except that it did not end there. The discarded body, the dead orc boy with the adamantium skull plate, lying in Ghazghkull's rubbish among the rejected experiments and failed procedures of decades of practice, was discovered by a small grot who worked for Ghazghkull in the capacity of general assistant and target of occasional frustration. The eye opened. Ghazghkull was alive. And the first thing his reopened consciousness encountered was not the darkness of the waste dump, not the pain of his injuries, not the confusion of waking up somewhere unexpected. It was a vision, a vast, all-encompassing, irreversible vision of what the universe was supposed to become. Right now, before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Honestly, knowing that someone in a completely different part of the world is following this story at 2 in the morning, or with their morning coffee, or on their lunch break, it genuinely means a lot. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Every subscriber keeps this channel alive and keeps these stories being told. Section 2. The bolter shell and the brain. The vision was not subtle. It was not the kind of thing that required interpretation or contemplation or the careful teasing apart of symbol and metaphor. It arrived complete and overwhelming, like a fire that was already burning before you became aware of it, like a sound so loud that your hearing shuts down, trying to process it. Ghazghkull, lying in the biological refuse behind Ghazghkull's operating shed with an adamantium plate replacing part of his skull and most of his original brain matter gone, received a revelation of such absolute clarity that it displaced everything else in his consciousness. He saw the orcs. Not any specific group of orcs, not the tribe on Urk, or the various warbands squabbling over territory across this particular dying world, but the orcs, all of them. Every greenskin anywhere in the galaxy, the billions upon billions of creatures scattered across thousands of worlds and asteroid belts and space hulks and ancient battlefields where the fighting had never quite stopped, all of them doing the one thing that they had been doing since the beginning of their existence as a species, fighting in whatever direction they happened to be pointing, for whatever immediate reason presented itself, with no coordination and no shared purpose and no understanding of what all that fighting was supposed to be building toward. And he saw it change. He saw them unite. He saw the species that had always been its own worst enemy, whose natural competitive aggression spent as much energy on internal conflict as on anything external, whose warlords spent as much time fighting each other as fighting outsiders. He saw them come together under one banner, pointed in one direction, driven by one purpose. He saw the size of the force that would result. He saw what the collective psychic output of a unified orc species would do to the warp, the way it would swell and intensify and call out to something vast and waiting, the way it would reach a threshold that had never been reached before. He saw the gods come through, Gork and Mork, the twin entities that every orc had believed in since the earliest moments of orc civilization, the warp presences that sustained and were sustained by greenskin collective faith, the beings who were simultaneously the orca's reflection in the immaterial realm and the orca's aspiration made divine. He saw them tear through the barrier between the warp and physical reality and join the greatest war ever fought. He saw a galaxy that burned with a green light so total that nothing else remained visible. He saw the end of everything else. And in the vision, this was not tragedy but triumph. He had been shown this because he was the one who would make it happen. Now, here is the question that has been argued over by scholars both within the setting and observing it from outside. What actually happened to Ghazghkull's brain? Did the gods genuinely speak to him? Was this a real divine transmission, an instance of the warp entities that the orcs collectively sustain reaching out to a specific individual to assign a specific mission? Or was it something more neurological? Catastrophic brain trauma combined with the particular kind of bionic reconstruction that Ghazghkull performed, perhaps triggering dormant psychic potential in ways that produced the subjective experience of revelation without any actual divine involvement. The honest answer, if you are paying attention to the way the Warhammer 40,000 universe handles these questions, is that the distinction may not be as clean as it appears. The orc gods are real entities. They exist in the warp, they have genuine power and genuine presence, and they are created by and fed by the collective psychic output of the orc species. This is not a matter of theological interpretation. The warp entities Gork and Mork have been observed, interacted with, fought, and documented in ways that place them beyond reasonable doubt in the category of real phenomena rather than imaginary ones. The question is whether they communicate with their followers in the way that Ghazghkull believes, and the warp being what it is, the truthful answer is that it probably does not work the way a conventional prayer and response model would suggest. And it also does not work in the entirely mechanical way that a pure neurological explanation would require. What can be said is this: the damage to Ghazghkull's brain and the subsequent reconstruction unlocked or activated psychic sensitivity that had previously been dormant in ways that other orcs' latent psychic potential was not. The warp-adjacent connection that all orcs share in passive form became, in Ghazghkull's case, something more active, a genuine ability to perceive currents in the immaterial realm that other orcs could not access. Whether this constitutes divine favor or simply unusual neurological architecture is a question that the universe permits both interpretations of. The result, regardless of cause, was absolute. Ghazghkull emerged from that waste dump as a different creature from the one who had entered it. Not physically different, not yet, not in the ways that would come later, but fundamentally, structurally, purposively different. He had a mission. He had a direction. He had the absolute certainty of someone who has been shown something so complete and so overwhelming that doubt is no longer a category of experience available to them. He emerged, and the first living thing he encountered was a small grot, unnamed at that point. Just one more of Ghazghkull's servants, going about the unremarkable business of scavenging through discarded materials for anything useful. Ghazghkull looked at this tiny creature, and then something happened that witnesses could not fully explain, and that the grot itself apparently experienced as the most significant moment of its existence. Ghazghkull shared the vision, not in words, in direct transmission, in the way that psychically active beings can sometimes convey things that language is not structured to carry, in eye contact that lasted only a moment but contained everything. The grot, whatever it had been before that moment, was changed by it. It understood. It had been permitted to see what the prophet had seen, and that permission was not something that could be undone. Ghazghkull named it Makari and appointed it his banner-bearer, Makari. The name would become as famous in the later accounts as almost any other in this story, though the fame was the fame of the companion rather than the principal, the grot, who followed the prophet into every terrible situation the prophet's mission required, and somehow, through some combination of extraordinary luck and the specific protection that comes from being genuinely necessary to someone that important, kept surviving. Makari's later testimony to imperial interrogators, a scene that provides the narrative frame for the best-sourced account of Ghazghkull's life, the novel that Black Library published under the title of his divine role, is the closest thing to a primary source that exists for much of what we know. The decision to appoint Makari as banner-bearer, rather than as simply another servant, was more considered than it might initially appear. Ghazghkull was thinking about the mission that had been given to him, about what it required, about the specific nature of the work ahead. What he needed was not more combat power. He was an orc, and combat power would come naturally from the position he intended to build. What he needed was a witness, someone who had seen the vision, who carried its memory as he carried it, who could stand beside him when doubt visited and remind him of what he had been shown. Makari, traumatized and transformed by the transmission, was that witness. It was a profoundly intelligent choice, revealing in itself something about the quality of mind that Ghazghkull was already demonstrating. Now, about Grotsnik specifically, because the Mad Pain Boy deserves more attention than a passing mention. Mad Grotsnik is, in the roster of supporting characters in this story, perhaps the most genuinely fascinating. He is not simply a loyal servant or a competent subordinate. He is something more complicated and more interesting than that, operating with his own agenda that overlaps with Ghazghkull's divine mission at some points and diverges from it significantly at others. He has, on multiple documented occasions, actively interfered with Ghazghkull's plans for his own reasons, killing Makari at one point because the grot's influence over the prophet irritated him, and because he saw an opportunity, nudging the warlord back toward Armageddon for the Third War, when the god's own apparent preference was for Ghazghkull to leave that world and pursue the larger mission, because Grotsnik had his own interest in what another Armageddon campaign would teach him. What makes this complexity more remarkable is that Grotsnik is, in his own assessment, a non-believer. He does not think the gods are directing anything. He thinks Gork and Mork, to whatever extent they exist as entities, are not particularly worth following. He has said as much to his own assistants in unguarded moments. And yet he devotes himself to Ghazghkull with a consistency and reliability that outlasts the most devoted of true believers. He gives Ghazghkull access to the best medical and biological care available anywhere in Orc society. He sits on the inner council. He advises. He protects. The reason, as best the evidence allows us to infer, is that Grotsnik is genuinely, irreversibly fascinated by what Ghazghkull is. As a biological specimen, as a case study in the interaction between massive trauma and psychic activation, as a test of the limits of what orc surgery can sustain and repair and enhance, Ghazghkull is the most interesting project Grotsnik has ever had access to, and losing access to it by having the prophet die or lose faith or stop needing the doc's services would be a genuine professional tragedy. The scientific curiosity that drove him to replace a shattered orc skull with adamantium in the first place has, in the decades since, become a consuming professional investment that keeps Grotsnik loyal in the most pragmatic possible way. There is something almost endearing about this, in the way that things in the Warhammer 40,000 universe occasionally manage to be endearing despite the surrounding darkness. The prophet of the orc gods, driven by divine certainty, accompanied everywhere he goes by a small lucky grot, and an increasingly mechanical mad surgeon who thinks the whole divine prophecy framework is probably nonsense but keeps showing up anyway because the scientific data is too interesting to walk away from. Back on Urk, in the time following Ghazghkull's recovery, the work of building what would become his crusade began. He started the way any orc leader starts, with personal demonstrations of capability. He fought. He won. He grew from the winning in the way that orcs grow from success, the body responding to achievement by becoming larger and more powerful, a biological feedback mechanism built in by the Old One's engineers to ensure that the most successful warriors became the most imposing figures in their communities. But there was a quality to his advancement that went beyond the physical. Orcs who fought alongside him described something that they did not have precise language for, a sense in battle that whatever they were doing was connected to something much larger, that the gods were paying attention, that the fighting had a weight and a significance that ordinary fighting did not have. This is consistent with what we know about how the orc collective psychic field operates. The presence of a being with Ghazghkull's level of active psychic connection to the warp would genuinely change the local psychic environment, would make the field around him stronger and more focused in ways that the orcs within it would perceive as a kind of heightened state. He was not simply inspiring them with words and victories, though he did both. He was, quite literally, changing the experience of being an orc in his vicinity. Within 6 years of his recovery, by 938 in the 41st millennium, he had risen from the absolute bottom of the Urk social hierarchy to the position of war boss of his own tribe. This is a journey that typically takes decades, and that many orcs attempt without ever completing it, dying in the attempt or hitting a ceiling they cannot break through. Ghazghkull did it in 6 years, driven by the urgency of his vision, the quality of his mind, and the genuine psychic amplification that his condition provided to everyone around him. He then began the larger work of unification. Section 3. The gathering of Urk's children unifying Urk's orc tribes was, in theoretical terms, impossible, not practically difficult, not challenging, impossible in the sense that the thing had never been done, and there were good structural reasons why it had never been done. The fundamental architecture of orc society was built around competition between tribes, around the principle that the strongest leader took everything and held it against all comers, and that this competitive pressure was not a bug but a feature. It produced the evolutionary pressure that made orcs the species they were. Asking tribes to subordinate their internal competitive instincts to a shared external purpose was asking them to work against their own nature. Ghazghkull understood this, which is why his approach to it was not a request. It was a combination of overwhelming personal authority, the psychic weight of divine mandate, and the practical argument that the alternative, staying on a planet whose sun was killing them in increments, was worse than whatever challenges unity might produce. The sun was key. In 939 of the 41st millennium, Urk's star entered a phase of rapid expansion toward red giant status, and the surface effects were dramatic and undeniable. Solar flares tore across continents that had no natural protection against radiation at this intensity. The sky took on colors that nothing in the orc color vocabulary had words for. Even the orcs, creatures who could survive vacuum and toxic atmosphere, and most of the other hostile conditions the galaxy offered, were dying from prolonged exposure. The planet was visibly, rapidly, terminally becoming uninhabitable. And in orbit above it, almost simultaneously with this crisis deepening to the point of no return, a space hulk appeared. Ghazghkull stood before whatever gathering of war bosses he could assemble and told them what this meant. The star burning their world was a sign. Gork was setting fire to their home to drive them out into the stars, because the stars were where their work waited for them. The space hulk in orbit was the vehicle for that work, provided by the gods at exactly the moment it was needed. This was not coincidence. This was choreography. The gods did not speak in words. They spoke in events, and those who had the wisdom to read events correctly would understand what was being asked of them. Several war bosses found this interpretation persuasive. Several others found it irrelevant to their primary concern, which was the practical question of leaving before the radiation killed everyone. Ghazghkull addressed these more pragmatic objections by having those war bosses fight him, or fight sufficiently capable representatives selected from his expanding inner circle, and the results were consistent. Within roughly a year, Urk's tribes were unified, not peacefully, not without cost, but united in the functional sense of all pointing in the same direction. Before he led the fleet away from Urk, Ghazghkull did something that is easy to overlook in the larger narrative, but that tells you a great deal about him. He boarded the space hulk, not to inspect it or to claim it, or to establish authority over it in the conventional orc way of simply being the biggest thing in a given space. He boarded it because the Space Hulk was full of things that should not have been there. Daimonic entities that had accumulated in the vessel during its long warp transit, things that had poured through a warp rift at the Hulk's center and established themselves in its vast interior. And Ghazghkull intended to address that. What followed was a boarding action that, by conventional military assessment, should have ended badly. The Space Hulk was enormous, and the entities within it were not the kind of thing that a warband of orc boys could reliably defeat through the application of sheer aggression. But Ghazghkull was not operating on conventional military logic. He was operating on faith, on the certainty that the gods did not send their prophet to die aboard a derelict vessel before the great work had even properly begun. He fought his way through the Hulk. His boys fought with the specific quality of engagement that characterized any operation he personally led, not simply violent, but committed in a way that went beyond ordinary orc ferocity, as though they understood they were doing something that mattered, something the gods were watching. They reached the warp rift at the center, and there, Ghazghkull was confronted by a bloodthirster. A bloodthirster is one of the greater demons of Khorne, the chaos god of warfare and blood. It is not an entity that appears on any list of things a reasonable being would willingly engage in single combat. It is vast. It is armored in the natural protection of its demonic form. It carries weapons that can tear through the most formidable armor in the galaxy, and it has existed for longer than human civilization has been literate. Space Marine companies have fought and been broken by single bloodthirsters. The entity does not have a conventional weak point that sufficient firepower can exploit if you have good intelligence about its physiology. Ghazghkull fought it. The accounts of what exactly transpired in that confrontation are filtered through Makari and various orc oral histories and are not, it should be acknowledged, what you would describe as forensically precise. What the accounts agree on is the outcome. The bloodthirster was driven back through the rift. The rift was closed by means that the accounts describe as involving a headbutt of sufficient force to seal the tear in reality, and Ghazghkull addressed whatever remained on the other side with a message that translates roughly as, "You have sent your worst, and your worst was not good enough. So, either send something larger next time, or keep out of his way." The Space Hulk was renamed World Killa, which is the kind of naming decision that only makes complete sense in the context of having just cleared it of its demonic infestation through personal combat. The fleet from Urk entered the warp. Their destination, which the visions had shown Ghazghkull with specific clarity, was a world called Armageddon. And everything that happened next flows from that decision to aim the dying world's desperate exodus in that particular direction. Section 4. The nature of the green tide. Before the fleet from Urk arrived at Armageddon, and before we can properly understand what that arrival meant and why it unfolded as it did, there is a necessary detour, a conversation that needs to happen about what an orc military force actually is and what makes it different from the convenient shorthand of big green monsters that hit things. This matters because the orcs are genuinely one of the most misunderstood major factions in the 41st millennium. Misunderstood not because the information is unavailable, but because the surface presentation is so aggressively misleading. They look like they should be easy to dismiss. The aesthetic choices, the crude construction, the scavenged weapons, the enthusiastic chaos of their military culture suggest disorganization at a level that a competent opponent could exploit. The reality is something significantly more alarming, and understanding Ghazghkull requires understanding the depth of the species he leads. The orcs were not made. They were designed. There is a difference. They did not arise through the processes of natural selection that produce most species, the billions of years of random genetic drift and environmental pressure that shaped humanity, for instance. They were created, deliberately and with considerable expertise, by the Old Ones. The Old Ones were an ancient species that occupied the galaxy in the epoch before recorded history, a civilization so technically and psychically advanced that the wars they fought and the tools they used in those wars are barely comprehensible to the intelligences of the 41st millennium. The Old Ones made the orcs as weapons, as a soldier race, optimized for warfare on a scale and in conditions that their own biology was not suited to sustain. The enemy the orcs were designed to fight in the war in heaven was the Necrontyr and their Satan masters, entities of living metal and stellar energy that could not be fought by conventional biological means. The original orcs, the Krork, were built to match that threat. Massive, nearly unkillable, self-reproducing, genetically encoded with military knowledge that didn't require formal training to access, capable of operating in environmental conditions that would kill anything else. Over millions of years since the Old One's civilization collapsed, the Krork became the Orcs, somewhat simplified from the original design, more chaotic and less centrally directed, but in the most fundamental respects, still exactly what they were built to be. Orc biology is a masterwork that the Imperium's best geneticists have studied for centuries without fully decoding. The base organism is a symbiosis, animal cells providing the familiar biological architecture of bones and muscles and organs, and fungal cells providing something more remarkable. The fungal component of an orc handles things that in other species require complex dedicated organ systems: immune function, wound healing, reproduction, and the transmission of genetic information. It is the fungal component that makes orcs so nearly unkillable in practice. A wound that would be fatal to a human by destroying a critical organ simply triggers a rapid compensatory response in the fungal network that threads through every part of the orc body, rerouting function and accelerating repair in ways that look, from the outside, like the biological equivalent of a particularly aggressive software patch. The regenerative capability this provides is extraordinary. Orcs have survived injuries that by any conventional medical assessment should be immediately fatal. They have continued fighting with both arms severed, with wounds that open their torsos to the air, with their skulls partially caved in. They are not immune to death. Sufficient damage, delivered quickly enough, will kill an orc as certainly as anything else. But the threshold for that sufficient damage is set dramatically higher than for any other species of comparable mass. And orc battlefield surgery, crude, brutal, performed under fire by beings who learned their craft through enthusiastic improvisation, is effective enough that injuries which would sideline human soldiers for months are addressed and functionally resolved within days. The reproduction system is perhaps the most strategically significant aspect of orc biology, and it is the reason why every military commander who has fought orcs and survived says the same thing. The only way to truly end an orc presence on a planet is to use exterminatus, the complete destruction of all life on the surface through orbital bombardment or similar means. Nothing less actually works, because orcs reproduce through spore release, and because those spores are released constantly throughout an orc's life and massively at the moment of death, any world that orcs have inhabited for any significant period has their biology threaded through its soil and water and air. Remove the current generation of orcs through military force, and the spores remain. Given time, they germinate. The cycle begins again. Decades after a planet has been declared cleared, feral orc tribes emerge from the wilderness as though the intervening time had not happened. This biological immortality at the species level is what makes the orc species the most numerous large predator in the galaxy, and why Imperial strategists have classified them as a threat that cannot be solved through conventional military means, only managed. The collective psychic field generated by orc populations is the other element that requires understanding. Every orc is slightly psychic, in the passive sense of contributing to and being influenced by the warp field generated by their species. This field, which orcs themselves might describe as the power of Gork and Mork, the energy of the gods made available to the faithful, grows in direct proportion to the number of orcs involved and the intensity of their collective emotional state. In practical terms, the bigger the orc gathering and the more focused its direction, the more powerful the effect of the field, which influences local space in ways that range from the marginally detectable to the genuinely alarming. This field is what feeds the entities orcs worship. Gork and Mork are not simply cultural inventions, not simply metaphors for the two faces of orc aggression, brutal and cunning, cunning and brutal. The constant internal debate of the orc species about which approach to prioritize in any given situation. They are real entities in the warp, shaped by and sustained by the psychic output of billions of orcs across the galaxy, and their reality has been confirmed by multiple independent observations from beings with no interest in validating orc theology. The orc species, without fully understanding it, has created gods that actually exist, and those gods' existence in turn reinforces the orc tendency toward war and violence that feeds them, in a cycle that has been running for millions of years. Ghazghkull's specific contribution to this system is not simply his individual power, extraordinary as that is. It is what he represents as a concept within the system. He is the most powerful psychic conduit in Orc history, the being through whom the field is strongest and most directed, in whose vicinity the collective energy achieves a coherence it cannot reach around other leaders. When Ghazghkull leads an Orc force into battle, the field around that force is not simply larger, it is more organized. It has a shape, and that shape is the shape of his vision. Everything aimed at a single point, every individual will subsumed in the collective movement toward the thing the gods have promised. This is why the size of his eventual crusade is not simply a military problem for the Imperium. It is a psychic problem, a warp problem, a problem that operates on a level of reality where conventional weapons and conventional strategy cannot reach. Dealing with Ghazghkull is not like dealing with a large army. It is like dealing with a living warp storm that is also personally making tactical decisions. Section 5. The Second War for Armageddon. The arrival of the fleet from Urk at the edge of the Armageddon system was preceded by approximately 1 month of chaos in the outer defenses, as the Space Hulk World Killa dismantled everything in its path. This was not a careful, tactical dismantling. It was what happens when an object the size of a small moon, containing weapon systems of unknown but clearly substantial power, moves through orbital infrastructure designed for threats on a completely different scale. Obsolete satellites were simply absorbed into the Hulk's path. Small attack craft that moved to intercept were handled by the same machinery that handled any other object that got in the way. By the time the main Orc landing force began disembarking, Armageddon's outer defensive layer had ceased to exist in any functional sense. The planet that received this attention was one of the most important industrial worlds in the Segmentum Solar, the region of the galaxy centered on the Sol system, where Terra, the heart of the Imperium, was located. Armageddon was a hive world, one of those planets so thoroughly industrialized over thousands of years of Imperial occupation that its surface was dominated by the enormous structures called hive cities, vertical megastructures housing billions of people and the manufacturing infrastructure they needed. Armageddon produced weapons, vehicles, and equipment in quantities that supplied Imperial Guard regiments across a significant portion of the sector. It was well defended, well populated, and militarily significant enough that its loss would have immediate strategic consequences for the Imperium's ability to project force in the region. Ghazghkull knew this. He had been shown this in his vision and had spent the years since Urk building his forces with this specific target in mind. He knew Armageddon in the way that skilled commanders know their objectives, not just the strategic value, but the texture of the place, the defensive patterns, the vulnerabilities that intelligence gathering and careful analysis could reveal to someone patient enough to look for them. The overlord of Armageddon at the time of the invasion was a man named Hermann von Straub, whose incompetence was of a quality that deserved specific and extended acknowledgement because it shaped everything that followed. Von Straub had inherited his position through a combination of birth, political connection, and the specific tolerance for mediocrity in leadership roles that any large bureaucratic organization develops over time. He was not merely unskilled, he was unskilled and confident, a combination that is reliably more dangerous than simple incompetence alone. He believed that Armageddon's existing defenses were sufficient, that the Orc threat was manageable, and that the advice of officers who had actually studied the approaching force and concluded otherwise was impertinent and best addressed by removing those officers from positions where they could bother him. The most significant removal was of a commissar named Sebastian Yarrick, who was stationed on Armageddon, and who had, through decades of experience and genuine study of Orc military culture, developed an assessment of the incoming threat that was accurate in almost every particular. Yarrick concluded that this was not an ordinary Orc raid, that the scale and organization of the fleet indicated something qualitatively different from the incursions that Armageddon's defenses had been designed to handle, and that reinforcements needed to be called for immediately. Von Straub found this conclusion inconvenient, and Yarrick's persistence in making it annoying, and banished the commissar to Hades' Hive as punishment for being correct. This decision was, in its consequences, perhaps the most cosmically consequential act of incompetent petulance in the history of the Armageddon system. The initial landings were catastrophic. The debris from the orbital battle and the descent of hundreds of craft created secondary destruction before anything reached the ground. The sky above multiple regions of Armageddon became briefly impassable for aircraft. Communication networks were disrupted. The coordination that Imperial defenses depended on was compromised before a single ground engagement was fought. The Orc landing craft came down across multiple vectors, some through careful guidance and some essentially as improvised kinetic weapons. The massive chunks of rock and metal, called rocks, that function as combination dropships and artillery when they impact a populated area. An entire Hive city, Hive Ufern, was destroyed in the initial landing sequence. Not assaulted and captured, destroyed, literally ceased to exist as a functioning urban center when the Space Hulk designated Claw of Desolation impacted directly on it. The casualty count from that single event alone ran to millions. Under von Straub's direction, the planet's defenses crumbled in a way that an intelligent observer might, if they were feeling uncharitable, describe as almost engineered to fail. The defensive lines that had been successfully held in previous Orc raids, the river crossings and geographic choke points where Armageddon's terrain offered natural defensive advantage, were not properly staffed because von Straub had reserved significant forces for the protection of his own position and had distributed the remainder in ways that were tactically incoherent. The Orcs swept through Armageddon Prime with a speed that surprised even some of Ghazghkull's own commanders, who had prepared for more resistance than they encountered, and then they reached Hades' Hive. Hades' Hive was one of the great hive cities of Armageddon Secundus, the southern continent, the industrial heartland of the planet, the region that, if it fell, meant the planet had functionally fallen regardless of what else happened. It was a natural choke point in the larger campaign, the kind of defensive objective that, if held, preserved the viability of the entire defensive position, and if lost, began the unraveling of everything else. Ghazghkull understood this. He directed his forces toward it with the emphasis of something that had been planned rather than improvised. What he had not planned for, because it was not plannable, was Sebastian Yarrick. Yarrick had arrived at Hades' Hive as a punishment posting, separated from the command structure where his expertise might have made a decisive difference earlier in the campaign. Equipped with the forces that happened to be at Hades, rather than the forces that a properly prepared defense would have positioned there. He was an old man, already past the age at which most soldiers would have retired, held together by augmetics and the particular stubborn vitality that certain human beings develop when they have decided that dying would be an inconvenience. He was facing an Orc force of overwhelming size, attacking a city that had not been prepared for siege, in a defensive context where the broader campaign was already going badly. He decided to hold it anyway. What Yarrick did at Hades' Hive over the months that followed is one of the most extraordinary individual acts in the military history of the Armageddon Wars, and it requires some time to do justice to it. He took the forces available to him, regular Imperial Guard, planetary defense forces, civilians pressed into service, and organized them into something that could resist assault after assault from Orc forces that maintained a significant numerical advantage throughout. He did this not primarily through tactical genius, though his tactical work was genuinely skilled, and not primarily through the threat mechanisms that commissars typically relied on to maintain discipline. He did it through presence. He was on the front line, every day. In the positions where the fighting was worst, where the casualties were heaviest, where the need for visible evidence that someone in authority believed the position was defensible was most acute. He was wounded repeatedly and kept fighting. He went to the places where the Orc attacks were breaking through and stood there, personally, in the fire, making it clear through his physical presence that the line he was standing on was the line, and that crossing it would require going through him specifically. Imperial soldiers who had spent their careers under commissars who used the threat of execution as their primary motivational tool encountered in Yarrick a different model, someone who did not need to threaten them, because they could see that he was asking them to do nothing he was not already doing himself. The record notes that not a single soldier was executed for cowardice at Hades' Hive during Yarrick's defense. This is, in the context of Imperial military history, essentially unprecedented. It speaks not to the absence of fear, but to the specific quality of leadership that transformed fear into something that could be stood in rather than fled from. Ghazghkull, watching this unfold through the intelligence his forces provided, and through the observations of commanders he sent to break what should have already broken, began to experience something genuinely unprecedented for him. He was impressed. Not simply acknowledging that an obstacle existed, he was capable of that cold tactical assessment from the beginning. He was impressed in a deeper sense, in a way that went past tactical respect and began to become something more personal. He sent Ugulhard, one of his strongest war bosses, to deal with Yarrick directly. Ugulhard was a significant force in his own right. Large, experienced, the kind of orc commander whose personal presence on a battlefield changed its outcomes. Yarrick killed him in single combat and took his power claw. This is worth sitting with. A human, regardless of augmetics or experience or personal ferocity, killing an orc warboss in direct combat is not a thing that happens regularly. The power differential is significant. Orc warbosses are large enough and strong enough and biologically resilient enough that the physical contest alone should be decisive in their favor. That Yarrick managed it, and not just managed it, but made it look like a statement, kept the weapon, wore it in subsequent battles as a trophy of the encounter, communicated something to Ghazghkull that no report or intelligence assessment could have. The word the orcs have for what Yarrick became to Ghazghkull from that point is scumgrod, the approximate translation being favorite enemy, though that phrase does not quite carry the full weight of the orc concept. It is the recognition of an opponent who is genuinely worthy of you. Someone whose opposition makes you better because it requires you to be better. Someone whose existence you value in a complicated way because the world you are constructing is diminished without them in it. This is not sentiment in the human sense. It is something more like the orc species version of aesthetic appreciation applied to warfare. The broader campaign turned against the orcs when the Space Marine reinforcements arrived. The Blood Angels under Commander Dante, Salamanders, Ultramarines, each chapter bringing its own capabilities to the relief of a planet that had held on longer than anyone had expected it to. Dante led a strike against Ghazghkull's command position, choosing the Warlord as his primary target, a reasonable assessment that if the commander could be removed, the Horde would lose coherence. Ghazghkull was not at his command position when the strike arrived. He had been touring his front lines, as he habitually did, and was absent at exactly the wrong moment. The strike did significant damage to the orc spearhead, but did not achieve its primary objective. The campaign was becoming a war of attrition, the kind of grinding engagement where orc biological resilience and numerical depth gave them long-term sustainability, but where the arrival of Space Marine forces and the stabilization of the Imperial defensive line had changed the cost calculation. Ghazghkull looked at the situation and made the decision that would confuse and frustrate his enemies for years. He left, not in defeat, not in a retreat driven by military necessity. He simply looked at what Armageddon had given him, tactical education, the confirmation of his divine mandate through the scale of the challenge it had presented, and the discovery of Yarrick, and concluded that the larger mission required him elsewhere. He created a diversion with a frontal assault that his commanders understood as tactical cover for his departure, and slipped away from Armageddon with his inner circle while the battle continued around them. The orc forces he left behind continued fighting for 20 years. Section 6, The Man with the Claw. The relationship between Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka and Sebastian Yarrick is, in the long catalog of rivalries and conflicts and adversarial relationships that fill the 41st millennium's history, something genuinely singular. Not the most destructive. That competition has a great many candidates. Not the most strategically significant, in the sense of having the most immediate impact on the galaxy's balance of power. But in terms of what it reveals about both participants, in terms of the specific quality of obsession and respect and mutual definition that it embodies, it sits in a category of its own. Consider the human side first, because Yarrick's story is in some ways more remarkable than Ghazghkull's, or at least more unexpected. Sebastian Yarrick was, at the time the orcs first arrived at Armageddon, already an old man. This point bears repeating because it is easy to lose track of in the drama of the wars themselves. He was past retirement age. He was, in fact, on the last day before his scheduled retirement when the invasion began. He had spent his career as a commissar, a role that in the Imperial Guard structure exists specifically to maintain discipline and morale through a combination of leadership example and the authority to summarily execute soldiers who refuse to do their duty. It is not, traditionally, a role associated with the kind of inspirational leadership that Yarrick exhibited at Hades' Hive. It is associated with fear and enforcement. Yarrick had spent his career learning a different approach, and central to that approach was something genuinely unusual for an Imperial officer. He had taken the time to understand his enemy. He had learned the orc language, formally, deliberately, starting from a captured raider early in his career and continuing through decades of study. He had read everything available in Imperial records about Orc military culture, about how Orc societies organized themselves, about the psychological patterns that drove Orc decisions. He understood Orcs as a subject, not simply as a threat to be responded to. This is the foundation of everything that followed, including the rivalry. When Yarrick observed Ghazghkull's invasion, he was not simply seeing an Orc assault on a quantitative scale he had not encountered before. He was seeing a specific kind of Orc, one who had combined the species' natural military aggression with a quality of sustained strategic vision that the accumulated Orc military intelligence he had studied said was not supposed to be possible. He recognized, before most of the Imperial command structure was prepared to, that this was not a problem that could be solved by the approaches that had worked on previous Orc problems. After the Second War, Yarrick dedicated the rest of his life to hunting Ghazghkull. He came out of the brief retirement that the war's conclusion allowed him. There is some dark comedy in the image of a man who postponed retirement to fight a continent-scale war, and then immediately unretired to chase the war's architect across the galaxy, and assembled tracking operations, intelligence networks, pursuit forces. He followed intelligence reports across multiple systems. He led operations against Orc installations that turned out to be secondary objectives, or decoys. He kept going. In 982 of the 41st millennium, Ghazghkull and an allied Bad Moon warlord named Nozdreg attacked the world of Piscina 4 using a previously unknown teleportation technology, teleportas in Orc terminology, that allowed forces to appear inside defensive perimeters that would otherwise require extended assault operations to breach. Yarrick arrived too late to prevent significant damage, but gathered intelligence about the technology that would inform later responses. The Battle of Golgotha, which came some years later, was the encounter that transformed the dynamic between them from pursuit to something more mutual. Yarrick had tracked Ghazghkull's forces to the planet Golgotha and engaged them with a significant Imperial force. The battle went badly for the Imperials. Ghazghkull had studied the Second War carefully and had developed approaches specifically designed to counter the coordinated defensive strengths on prepared ground that Imperial forces favored. He arranged the fighting to be scattered and chaotic, exactly the conditions where Orc resilience and numerical depth outperformed Imperial coordination and firepower. Yarrick's force took heavy casualties, and Yarrick was captured. In Orc culture, the normal fate of a captured enemy of significance is death, usually public and demonstrative. The relationship between conqueror and captive in Orc military tradition does not generally include a conversation about the future or a respectful exchange of intelligence assessments. It includes violence, and then the captive stops being a problem. Ghazghkull did something different. He kept Yarrick alive. He spent time with him, time that the Orc prophet used to demonstrate, in what might be described as a deeply peculiar form of showing off, the accuracy of his predictions about how the Imperium would respond to his campaigns. He used Yarrick as a kind of proof of concept, showing his subordinates that his understanding of human military psychology was precise enough to model their reactions in advance with a specificity that felt less like analysis and more like prophecy. And then he sent Yarrick home, with a message that amounted to, "I am going back to Armageddon. Make sure the defense is better this time." This act defies the usual frameworks for understanding enemy behavior. It is not mercy. Ghazghkull does not release enemies out of compassion, and nothing in his character or his history suggests that compassion operates as a significant factor in his decision-making. It is something more Orc, and more specific to Ghazghkull's particular nature. The war against Yarrick had been the best war he had fought. The defense of Hades' Hive had been the most demanding challenge his campaigns had encountered. The Second War for Armageddon had been, in the Orc hierarchy of what makes a conflict worth having, the closest thing to genuinely satisfying that he had experienced. He wanted more of it. He wanted it to be even better. He wanted Yarrick to have 50 years to prepare, because 50 years of Yarrick's preparation would produce a defense that would be worth attacking. The practical cost of giving his enemy that preparation time was real. Yarrick would not waste those years, and the defenses of Armageddon that awaited the Third War were significantly more formidable than they had been for the Second. But the quality of the fight was worth it. Yarrick returned to Armageddon. He knew it was coming. He spent the years that remained to him making the planet as ready as anything could be made ready for what was coming. And on the anniversary date, 57 years after the Second War began, he was standing at his post when the sky turned green. The third war for Armageddon was worse than the second in almost every particular. More orcs, more coordination, more tactical sophistication from Ghazghkull, who had spent 5 decades in active campaign across multiple theaters learning everything that could be learned about fighting the Imperium. More severe fighting, more complete destruction, more civilian casualties, a wider area of the planet reduced to contested wasteland. Yarek's preparations helped. Without them, the planet would have fallen in the opening months, rather than holding on long enough for major Space Marine deployment. But there was also something that Yarrisk had not been able to fully prepare for, which was the sheer scale of what Ghazghkull had assembled. The 3 allied warlords who joined the Third War, the Great Despot of Dregruk, Urgok, the Unstoppable, the Overfiend of Octarius, each brought forces large enough that their contribution alone would have constituted a major invasion. Together, under Ghazghkull's coordination, they represented something the Imperium had not faced since the Beast. Yarrick fought through all of it. He was on the front lines throughout the campaign, still doing what he had done at Hades' Hive 40 years earlier, being visibly present in the worst places, making the implicit argument that the position was worth holding by being himself unmoved from it. He engaged Ghazghkull directly on multiple occasions, and the accounts of these encounters suggest that the dynamic between them had not simplified with time. If anything, the mutual regard had deepened. 2 beings, both of whom had dedicated enormous portions of their existence to this specific conflict, meeting on the field where that conflict had first been defined. The campaign eventually became a stalemate. The orcs holding enormous territory, but unable to deliver the final blow. The Imperials unable to drive the invaders off. Ghazghkull, whose attention span for any situation that had stopped generating new information was finite, grew restless. The gods were speaking to him again with the particular urgent displeasure they showed when he was working against rather than toward the larger vision. He left the management of the stalemate to his generals and departed Armageddon for the 2nd time, this time pursued by both Yarrick and the Black Templars' High Marshal Helbrecht. The pursuit that followed covered multiple systems and ended, as noted, in the Haunted Gulf, where Ghazghkull's flagship vanished in a blaze of green energy. Yarrick and Helbrecht reported Ghazghkull's escape, and, in the aftermath, Yarrick continued his pursuit, following reports of the warlord's activities as best the disruptions of the Great Rift permitted. His own ancient body kept functional by augmetics and medical intervention that would have been extreme for a man half his age. The rivalry did not end. It has not ended. Wherever Ghazghkull is, and wherever Yarrick is, the dynamic between them, that specific strange relationship of mutual definition between the prophet of the green gods and the old man who has spent his life refusing to let the green tide wash over the things he was charged with protecting, remains one of the more extraordinary threads running through the current state of the galaxy. Section 7. The Third War and the Great Departure. The 57-year gap between the Second and Third Wars for Armageddon was not, on Ghazghkull's side, a period of dormancy. It was a period of active, purposeful preparation that was hidden in plain sight precisely because the Imperium's intelligence services were looking for large-scale actions, and what they got was a carefully orchestrated campaign of small ones. From around 945 to 959 of the 41st millennium, Ghazghkull personally led raids and attacks against Imperial outposts and bases that were small enough to fall below the threshold that would trigger major Imperial response. Each of these actions had a purpose beyond the immediate tactical objective. He was testing things, new approaches, new technologies, new ways of engaging Imperial military responses that he could observe and learn from without exposing himself to the kind of counterforce that would have threatened his broader plans. He was studying. In 962 of the 41st millennium, an Imperial military base on the world of Buka III was destroyed by missiles fired from an orc installation hidden within an asteroid, an operation of significant technical sophistication, requiring the concealment of a weapons platform in a piece of space debris for an extended period while the asteroid was maneuvered into position. This was not the work of ordinary orc technical creativity. This was planned. The alliance with Nasdregug Erdgrob, the Bad Moon warlord, produced the teleporta experiments. Teleportation, the ability to move forces instantaneously from one location to another, was not new technology in the galaxy. The Eldar had sophisticated versions of it built into their infrastructure. the Chaos powers could achieve something similar through warp manipulation. But Orc teleporta technology, which Orc mech boys had been theorizing about for decades without achieving reliable results, was a different proposition. Nazdreg's contribution, combined with the resources and focus that Ghazghkull could bring, produced working teleportation at a scale that Imperial defenses had no framework for responding to. The attack on Pesina 4, where Orc forces appeared inside defensive perimeters without warning, was both a tactical operation and a demonstration of what this technology could do at scale. Ghazghkull was building a toolkit, not just forces, though the forces were growing too. A toolkit of tactics, technologies, approaches, and alliances that would make the eventual return to Armageddon, and the larger crusade that would follow, different in kind from anything the Imperium had faced from an Orc force. The Third War itself was, as we covered, a massive and devastating affair that ultimately resolved into a stalemate. Not the decisive conquest that Ghazghkull's forces were capable of producing against less determined defenders, but also not the defeat that the Imperium needed in order to claim victory in any meaningful sense. The planet was consumed by war. The death toll was staggering. The Orc forces, even after Ghazghkull's departure, maintained enough presence and momentum to continue the conflict for years. What the Third War really was, in retrospect, was the final exam. Ghazghkull's last test of Imperial military response, under conditions where he was using substantially all of what he had learned. The data he gathered from conducting the largest Orc military operation in 8,000 years against some of the most capable defenders the Imperium could assemble informed everything he did subsequently. The departure itself, the escape from the Haunted Gulf, the disappearance of Kilrekka in Green Fire, is one of the more dramatic moments in recent galactic history, and its consequences extend far beyond the immediate military context. The spatial anomaly left behind by Kilrekka's disappearance merged with other warp disturbances in ways that contributed, according to the most credible analyses available, to the formation of the Great Rift. The Great Rift is the catastrophic tear in real space that divided the galaxy, cut off the Emperor's light from billions of worlds, and fundamentally restructured the strategic situation of the entire Imperium. If Ghazghkull's escape played even a minor role in triggering that event, then the consequences of failing to stop him at the Haunted Gulf are incalculably large. Ghazghkull emerged, according to the reports that eventually made their way through the chaos of the post-Rift galaxy in the Octarius sector. This was already the site of the Octarius War, a conflict that Imperial strategists had deliberately engineered by diverting a Tyranid hive fleet into an existing Orc empire, the theory being that mutual attrition between the two most destructive biological forces in the galaxy would reduce the threat posed by both. The conflict was ongoing, grinding, producing casualties on both sides in numbers that were difficult to calculate precisely because neither Orcs nor Tyranids file comprehensive battlefield reports. Ghazghkull's arrival changed the equation. He was not interested in the Tyranids particularly. He was interested in the Orcs of Octarius, the vast armies that had been fighting against the Hive fleet, that had been tested and hardened by years of the most brutal kind of warfare the galaxy offered, that had been led by a series of increasingly powerful war bosses as the weaker ones were killed off and replaced by beings capable of surviving what Octarius demanded. He was interested in absorbing them into his crusade. The warlord of Octarius, Zog Steeltooth, had to be dealt with before the absorption could happen. Ghazghkull dealt with him with characteristic directness and efficiency. And with the Orcs of Octarius added to his gathering banner, the crusade that had started on Urk was now the largest Orc military force assembled since the War of the Beast, 9,000 years earlier. Section 8. Death, Resurrection, and the Question of Size. There is a logical problem embedded in any discussion of what it means to be unkillable. If you are described as unkillable, and then you are killed, the description is wrong. But if you are described as unkillable, and then you are killed, and then you come back from that death larger and more powerful than before, a reasonable argument can be made that the original description was in fact accurate. Not that death cannot be inflicted, but that death cannot be sustained. That the mechanism of ending is available, but the actual end, the permanent cessation, the final conclusion, is not. Ghazghkull Mag Rukhthraka was killed on the planet Krongar. This is not disputed. The physical evidence was clear, the testimony of the witnesses on both sides was consistent, and the biological definition of death as the permanent cessation of function of critical organs was met in the most literal possible way. He was decapitated. His head was separated from his body by a blade wielded by a space wolf named Ragnar Blackmane, and the separation was complete and definitive. He came back. Ragnar Blackmane had been, for some time before Krongar, pursuing Ghazghkull across systems in response to what the space wolf described as a vision. His weird, in the terminology of his chapter, a sense of personal fate that space wolves take seriously, and that had been directing him toward a confrontation with the prophet of the green gods, with a specificity that could not be attributed purely to tactical assessment. He led a force of his warriors into the orc presence on Krongar and made his way, through whatever combination of fighting and determination and the assistance of his brothers, to the place where Ghazghkull was. What happened next shows something about both of them that is important to understand. Ghazghkull could have killed Ragnar in the opening of their engagement, with numbers and surprise, and the overwhelming physical advantage that a fully armored orc warlord of his size had over even a space marine wolf lord. He did not. He set up the conditions for a one-on-one confrontation instead, literally detonating explosives to block the entrance to the cathedral they were fighting near, sealing himself and Ragnar in together, removing the involvement of their respective supporting forces. This is not tactical thinking. This is theology. Ghazghkull wanted the fight. He wanted the specific kind of fight that meant something, a contest between two individuals of genuine capability in conditions that stripped everything away except what they each were. He had done this before, in various forms. The gods valued this kind of combat. It had weight in the warp, in the record of what it meant to be an orc prophet. The fight that followed was as brutal as anything Krongar's history had seen. Ragnar fought with everything a space marine wolf lord could bring to bear, and Ragnar was exceptional, even within that already extraordinary category. He managed to sever the hydraulic cabling in Ghazghkull's armor, a significant technical achievement requiring both skill and the specific kind of insight that comes from studying an opponent carefully rather than simply attacking them. The damage slowed Ghazghkull, compromised the power assistance that made the enormous armor manageable, but it did not stop him. An orc of Ghazghkull's size and biological investment does not stop because his armor is less responsive. He seized Ragnar in his power claw and began the process of ending the Space Wolf's career. Ragnar, on the edge of death, in a state where conscious tactical thinking was probably not the primary mode of operation, found one last coherent physical action available to him. He drove his frost blade up through the gap that Ghazghkull's grip and the architecture of the armor created, and he cut. He cut off Ghazghkull's head. He raised it above him and howled his victory, and then he passed out from his injuries and was recovered by his chapter, and, because Astarte's medical technology is formidable, and because the Rubicon Primaris procedure was available for exactly the kind of catastrophic wound that should have been his last, was ultimately restored to service as a Primaris space marine. Ghazghkull's headless body remained on the floor of the cathedral for 10 days and 10 nights. There is something worth sitting with in that specific detail of 10 days and nights. It is not a biological time frame. An orc's body, even an orc's extraordinary biology, does not maintain itself in a functional state without its head for 10 days, and the accounts are not claiming that it did in any conventional sense. What the 10 days represent, in the religious and narrative framework of the story, is a period of divine decision. Was the prophet's mission complete? Had the gods received enough from this particular vessel, or was the work unfinished, and the instrument still needed? Grotznik, meanwhile, was working. He had received Ghazghkull's head from the grot who found it, and had immediately begun planning the response. The response was, by any measure, the most extreme medical operation in the history of an already extremely unhinged medical practice. He needed to build a body, not reconstruct the old one, which was inadequate for the task, even if it had been recoverable. He needed to build something new, larger, better suited to what the prophet's next phase of existence required. He obtained macrocapacitors. The accounts of how are not entirely clear, but macrocapacitors capable of generating the power he needed would normally be found on major orbital installations or large warships, and the specifics of their acquisition are left to the imagination. He constructed a new body, a towering armored form that incorporated elements of mega armor, bespoke enhancements that existed nowhere else in orc manufacture, and systems of biological support and augmentation that represented decades of Ghazghkull's best work applied all at once. And then he ran the power through it. His own assessment of the probability of this working, without also destroying a significant portion of the surrounding planetary surface, was approximately 1 in 5 in favor of success. He ran the power anyway. He connected Ghazghkull's head to the new body, arranged the apparatus, and activated the capacitors in a display of green lightning that witnesses reported seeing from the far side of the continent. Ghazghkull lived. He stood up in Ghazghkull's makeshift laboratory and was, visibly, significantly larger than before. Not incrementally larger, not the normal orc growth that comes from sustained success in combat. Dramatically, impossibly larger. A being whose size now placed him in the range of the military walkers and heavy combat platforms that Imperial armies relied on, rather than in the range of anything biological. Looking at accounts of his post-Krongar dimensions and comparing them to descriptions from before the battle, the increase in scale was substantial enough that some observers initially doubted they were describing the same individual. For his followers, this was the moment. Not the Second War for Armageddon, not the Third War, not the long buildup of the Great Crusade. This was the moment that proved everything. The prophet had died. The gods had brought him back. And when they brought him back bigger, because the work was not done, and bigger was what the remaining work required. The effect on orc recruitment and unity across the galaxy was immediate and dramatic. War bosses who had maintained a cautious distance from committing fully to Ghazghkull's banner, watching, assessing, unwilling to subordinate themselves without sufficient proof that this was genuinely the moment the gods had promised, saw the proof. The prophet died and returned from death more powerful than before. What additional evidence could be required? Ragnar came back to Krongar. He had recovered, transformed by the Primaris process into something more formidable than what had faced Ghazghkull the first time. He needed to see for himself. He found that the beast lived, that the decapitation had not produced the outcome he had witnessed with his own eyes, that somehow the galaxy continued to contain Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, walking around in a body that was now disturbingly close to the scale of a dreadnought. The second engagement between them was inconclusive. Ghazghkull had other places to be. The Great Crusade was not going to wait for a rematch, however enjoyable the rematch might be. Section 9. The Great Green Crusade. What Ghazghkull has assembled in the time since his resurrection and departure from the aftermath of Krongar defies convenient summary. The best attempts at it involve numbers that lose their meaning after a certain scale. The Imperial intelligence estimate of 5 million ships in his fleet alone is a figure that, if broken down into what it represents in terms of orc crew numbers, fighter complement, weapon capacity, and logistical infrastructure, describes a military force comparable in size to the entire Imperial Navy presence in several entire subsectors combined. But the numbers are less important than the structure, and the structure is the genuinely unprecedented thing. Orc armies have been large before. The orc species is the most numerous large predator in the galaxy, and when motivated, they can produce military forces whose numerical strength rivals anything the Imperium or its enemies can field. What has never happened in 8,000 years is an orc force of this scale operating with genuine unified purpose. The internal competition that normally bleeds orc military capability, the constant challenge and response dynamic, the war boss who devotes as much energy to fighting his own lieutenants as to fighting external enemies, the tribal affiliations that limit how large any single coherent unit can actually be before it splinters. All of this has been reduced dramatically in Ghazghkull's crusade, not eliminated. Orcs are not a different species because Ghazghkull leads them, and the fundamental competitive dynamics of greenskin society have not been reformed through sheer force of will, but managed, directed. The internal competition that cannot be eliminated has been channeled into the external campaign rather than allowed to fragment the force. War bosses who would normally spend significant energy on competing with each other are spending that energy on Ghazghkull's chosen targets, because the targets that Ghazghkull selects are interesting enough and numerous enough to provide the constant fighting that orc aggression requires. The warlords who have joined the crusade represent something that should have been impossible. The great despot of Dregruk, whose own forces were large enough to threaten multiple systems independently, has subordinated himself to Ghazghkull's banner. The Overfiend of Octarius, veteran of years of the most brutal fighting in the galaxy, has added his considerable military resources to the crusade. Warlords who had spent decades fighting each other have found themselves fighting together under conditions that make the arrangement, if not comfortable, at least functional. The mechanism that makes this possible is divine mandate, not the crude assertion of personal superiority that normally governs orc political relationships. Though that element is present, because Ghazghkull is also physically among the largest and most formidable orcs in the galaxy, and the credibility of divine mandate is substantially enhanced when the deity's prophet can also kill you relatively easily if he chooses to. But the specific claim, reinforced by the events of Krongar, that the gods have chosen this particular orc for this particular purpose, and that opposing that purpose puts you on the wrong side of divine intent. Orc religion is real in a way that very few religious frameworks in the 41st millennium are. When an orc is told that the gods want something, he has access, through the collective psychic field he participates in, to something that feels like evidence. The field is real. It is stronger around Ghazghkull. It is stronger when the crusade moves with focus and purpose than when it drifts. This is not imagination or wishful thinking. It is a measurable effect of the warp on local physical reality, and the orcs within it can feel it. When Ghazghkull says the gods are speaking, the orcs around him can feel that something is different in the field, that whatever is happening is not normal, that there is a quality to the collective experience of being in his presence that justifies the word divine, even in the limited vocabulary available for such concepts. The simultaneous sightings of Ghazghkull across multiple systems, reports that arrive at Imperial command structures from credible sources describing his personal presence in battles, happening on planets that are physically impossible to reach from each other in the implied time frame, have become one of the more unsettling puzzles of the current era. The mundane explanations range from misidentification, other large orcs being reported as Ghazghkull by observers who see a very large green skin and draw the obvious conclusion, to deliberate orc misinformation. It is not beyond the orc mechboy community to construct convincing enough visual simulacra to confuse Imperial sensors, to simple timing distortion caused by the warp chaos of the post-Rift galaxy. The less mundane explanation involves the possibility that Ghazghkull's connection to the collective orc psychic field has reached a threshold where his consciousness can be distributed, where the field is strongest, where his followers are most concentrated, most focused, most united in the vision he gave them. He may be genuinely, functionally present in ways that do not require his physical body to be in the room. This would make him not just a powerful warlord, but something that is beginning to function as an aspect of the orc race's own warp presence, a living expression of Gork and Mork made manifest in the material realm. If this is true, it has implications that go well beyond the military. It means the crusade is not simply a very large army. It is a religious event, a psychic event, an event that is changing the nature of the thing it claims to be in service of. The comparison to the beast that comes up in every serious analysis of Ghazghkull deserves extended consideration because it is both apt and importantly limited. The beast, in the 32nd millennium, was an orc of extraordinary power who somehow achieved a level of coordinated strategic action that should have been impossible for the species, orchestrating simultaneous attacks across multiple systems, demonstrating a tactical intelligence that went far beyond anything the Imperium had attributed to an orc before. The beast came close enough to exterminating humanity that the response required the mobilization of Primarchs and the sacrifice of an entire Space Marine chapter, and even then the victory was narrow and the costs enormous. The beast's power was primarily personal and immediate. He was individually overwhelming in ways that could not be countered through normal means. Ghazghkull's power is structural and cumulative. He may not be as physically overwhelming as the beast was at the peak of his individual development, but the beast operated alone in a strategic sense, with forces that followed his will but did not share his vision. Ghazghkull has built something that can survive him, a movement with its own momentum, a crusade with its own logic, a vision that lives in the minds of billions of orcs who will pursue it whether or not their prophet is physically present to direct them. This is arguably more dangerous in the long run. You can kill a very powerful individual. It is much harder to kill an idea held by a species of billions. Section 10. The question of faith and what comes next. We have spent this entire account following the events of Ghazghkull's life and trying to understand them in terms of cause and consequence, strategy and outcome, the interplay of individual will and historical circumstance. Before we arrive at the present moment and the question of what comes next, there is a deeper question worth considering. A question that, I think, is the most interesting thing about this story, and the reason it lands with the weight it does. Does he believe? This might seem obvious. He has organized his entire existence around a divine vision. He has walked away from military victories because the gods called him elsewhere. He died and came back, and the coming back seems to have been arranged precisely because the mission was not complete. He is, by any reasonable assessment, the most committed religious figure in the 41st millennium's gallery of true believers. But belief in a universe where the gods are provably real is a more complicated thing than it is in a universe where their existence is purely a matter of faith. The orc gods exist. Their power is documented. Their influence on physical reality is measurable. So, when Ghazghkull says, the gods have spoken to him, the question is not whether the gods are real, they are, but whether they have communicated with him in the specific way he believes they have. Whether the vision he received in Grotznik's waste dump was a genuine divine transmission or an extraordinary hallucination produced by brain damage and psychic activation. Whether the pattern he has been following is a divine plan or a plan he has made himself and attributed to divine source. The honestly unsettling answer, which the Warhammer 40,000 universe often provides for questions like this, is probably both, and the distinction may not be as meaningful as it seems. The gods are real and are the product of orc collective belief. Ghazghkull's vision was the result of psychic activation through physical trauma. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. The vision can be both a genuine communication from warp entities and a product of his own neurology, because his own neurology is connected to the warp entities in question. The plan can be simultaneously his and theirs, because he is the most powerful conduit for their expression that the species has ever produced. What this means for the question of faith is that Ghazghkull's belief is real in the most significant sense, not correct in every theological detail, not verified in every specific prediction, but real in its foundation. He is connected to something genuinely present and genuinely powerful. That connection is real. Whether the specific prophecy about the Ragnarok and the gods tearing through the veil, whether that plays out exactly as the vision showed, is a separate question, and one the universe has not yet answered. What we can say about Ghazghkull with confidence is this: his faith makes him patient. It makes him capable of walking away from winning positions, because the larger plan requires it. It makes him capable of sustaining purpose across decades and centuries in a species whose attention span is normally measured in battles. It makes him capable of dying and not treating that as the end, because the gods have a plan, and a plan has a timeline that is not bounded by an individual's physical continuity. This patience is the most militarily significant thing about him, more than his size, more than his tactical intelligence, more than the divine psychic amplification he provides to the forces around him. An enemy who cannot be exhausted, who will not lose focus, who measures success on a timeline that extends beyond any individual campaign. That kind of enemy cannot be managed by the methods that work on ordinary threats. The Imperium, for all its extraordinary resources and extraordinary capacity for absorbing and responding to crises, is built around methods that assume a finite adversary. An adversary that can be depleted, defeated, driven off, killed. Everything about Imperial military doctrine is calibrated to produce those outcomes. Ghazghkull does not fit into those categories in a way that makes the doctrine applicable. He is patient. He is growing. He is building something that has survived his own death. And somewhere in the stars, in whatever system currently hosts the largest concentration of his crusade, the collective psychic field of the largest orc force in 8,000 years is generating a disturbance in the warp that experienced psychers describe, in the moments when they perceive it most clearly, as the sound of something enormous waking up. The orc gods have been patient too. They have waited millions of years for the species they sustain to produce what it was built to produce. They have watched billions of cycles of orc violence that burned itself out before it could be directed, before it could be accumulated and aimed. They have waited for an orc who could hold the direction long enough for the accumulation to reach the threshold the vision describes. Whether Ghazghkull is the one who gets them there, or whether his crusade is the foundation that some future orc builds the final structure on, or whether the vision was wrong about how it ends, even if it was right about the forces it describes, these are questions that belong to the future of a galaxy that is still being written. What belongs to the past, and to the record that we have assembled here, is the story of a creature who started as nobody on a dying world, who was accidentally killed by an automated defense system, who came back from that death with a vision that changed everything, who spent more than a century building toward that vision through a combination of divine faith and genuine tactical genius and the specific kind of stubborn refusal to stop that defines the best and worst things about the orc species, who was killed a second time and came back from that death larger, who has assembled the largest unified orc force in living memory and is pointing it at the galaxy with the certainty of someone who has been shown where this ends and believes every word of it. The name that gets spoken in war councils, in hushed and careful voices, by people who have studied what it has meant and what it continues to mean. Ghazghkull, the prophet, the beast. And whatever comes next, it will not be quiet. If you made it to the end of this, thank you, genuinely. Stories like this one take time to tell properly, and the fact that you stayed with it all the way through matters more than I can easily express. If it resonated, if you found yourself absorbed in it, if you want more of these long, careful explorations of the 40k universe's most extraordinary figures, please subscribe and hit the bell so you know when the next one arrives. A like helps more than most people realize. And drop a comment. Tell us what you think. Tell us where you want to go next in this universe. Tell us whether you think Ghazghkull's vision is real, or whether it is the most consequential accident in galactic history. There are so many more stories to tell, and we intend to tell every single one of them. Until next time, stay curious. Expanded, the orcs as a civilization, deeper than they appear. There is a conversation that happens with some regularity among people who engage seriously with the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it goes something like this. The orcs are the comic relief. They are there to provide levity. They are the silly faction, the one with the funny accents and the ramshackle vehicles and the jokes about believing red vehicles go faster that are so sincere they actually work. They are not, in this reading, to be taken as seriously as the grimdark human empire, or the ancient star gods, or the horror from beyond space Tyranids. They are the fun faction, the one you pick when you want to paint something colorful and not think too hard about what it represents. This reading is wrong, not in the sense of being ungenerous. The orcs are funny, and the humor is clearly intentional and well executed, and there is nothing wrong with enjoying that aspect of them. But in the sense of being incomplete in a way that misses what makes them, in some respects, the most genuinely terrifying faction in the setting. Let us think about what the orcs actually are. They are a species designed by a civilization so advanced that the current galaxy's greatest powers are essentially rummaging through their aftermath. They are designed for war in a comprehensive sense that goes beyond military training or cultural preference for violence. They are war in the biological sense. Every system of their existence is optimized for the function of combat and conquest, including the reproduction system, which ensures that the population bounces back from catastrophic losses almost immediately, including the social hierarchy, which ensures that the most capable warriors are always in leadership positions, and that the overall quality of orc leadership improves under combat pressure, including the psychic architecture, which generates a collective field that powers the species gods and that improves in quality and power as more orcs fight together in unified purpose. They cannot be ended. Not really, not on a permanent basis below the level of total planetary destruction. They seep through the biological equivalent of cracks. Their spores seed any environment they have ever occupied, and given sufficient time, the orc ecosystem reestablishes itself from essentially zero. The Imperium has, on multiple occasions, declared orc infestations cleared, committed the resources necessary to verify that clearing, and then discovered, several decades later, that a new generation of orcs had grown up from dormant spores in the wilderness. They grow stronger from fighting, not metaphorically in the motivational sense, physically, biologically stronger. Every combat encounter that an orc survives contributes to their continued physical development. Every victory adds to the resources available for growth. The most successful orcs in a given generation are the ones who have survived the most, which means they are also the ones who have grown the most, which means that orc society self-selects continuously for the production of larger and more formidable individuals in the most senior positions. Ghazghkull has been fighting continuously for over a century. The implications for his current physical dimensions are not subtle. The psych-out factor, the collective field, is something that the Imperium has no equivalent of. The Space Marines benefit from their chapter culture and their bonds of brotherhood. The Chaos Powers benefit from the warp presence of their patron deities. But neither of these produces the specific effect that the Orc collective field produces, which is a genuine quantitative enhancement of combat capability that scales with the number of participants and the unity of their purpose. 1,000,000 orcs fighting with genuine unified direction are not just numerically equal to 1,000,000 isolated orcs. They are better, individually and collectively, than those same 1,000,000 orcs would be if their focus were fragmented. Ghazghkull's crusade, because of its unprecedented unity of purpose, has been operating at a psychic efficiency that no previous orc military force has achieved. There is also the matter of orc technical capability, which is consistently underestimated even after decades of documented evidence that the underestimation is wrong. The assumption that orc technology is primitive is based on a surface reading of its aesthetics. It looks improvised, it sounds wrong, it should not work. The reality is that orc mechboys are operating with an intuitive engineering knowledge that is encoded in their biology and derived from the work of civilization. Architects vastly more sophisticated than anything the current galaxy contains. They cannot always explain what they build. They cannot always reproduce it consistently, but the knowledge they have access to is ancient and deep and capable of producing outcomes that seem impossible from the outside. The teleporta technology that Ghazghkull and Nozdreg tested and then deployed at scale is one example. The modifications that Grotznik performed on Ghazghkull, the bionic enhancements, the reconstruction after Krongar, the integration of increasingly mechanical systems with the biological core of the warlord's body, are another. The fact that Ghazghkull's flagship Kill Rekka apparently vanished from the material realm in a controlled and intentional manner rather than a catastrophic one, leaving behind a precisely shaped spatial anomaly rather than debris, suggests technical capability in the area of warp navigation and warp engineering that the Imperium cannot match and does not fully understand. And the squigs. We should talk about squigs, because they are perhaps the most representative example of the orc biological ecosystem's completeness. Squigs are creatures that exist entirely within the orc ecosystem, performing various functions ranging from food source to ammunition to pets to hairstyle to weapons. They are grown from the same spore complex as every other orc organism, adapting to whatever niche is currently available in the ecosystem. They are evidence, in a way that is almost beautiful if you can get past the context, of the sophistication of the original biological engineering, a self-replicating ecosystem that can produce whatever support organisms a warrior species needs, adapting to local conditions and requirements without centralized direction. The orcs are not the comic relief. They are a horror story told in a funny accent. And the funniness does not diminish the horror, but coexists with it in a way that is actually more unsettling than pure horror would be. Expanded. The planet Armageddon and why it keeps mattering. Armageddon has now been the site of 3 separate cataclysmic wars in recorded Imperial history. And there is an argument to be made that the planet has a kind of narrative gravity, a tendency to attract the galaxy's great conflicts to itself, that goes beyond simple strategic logic. There are many important industrial worlds in the Imperium. There are many hive worlds in the Segmentum Solar. Not all of them have had 3 separate existential invasions in the span of a few centuries. The first war for Armageddon, which is not Ghazghkull's war, involved a different kind of enemy entirely. It was a conflict against demonic incursion, the forces of the blood god Khorne, led by the demon Primarch Angron, whose presence on Armageddon's surface was catastrophic in ways that the official Imperial record has gone to significant lengths to suppress. The reason for the suppression is that the First War's resolution and the nature of what was actually fought there are classified at levels that most Imperial citizens are not cleared to know. What can be said is that the planet survived, and that the survival required extraordinary measures, and that the world that Ghazghkull attacked in 941 was already a world that had been through something and carried the residual weight of it in ways both physical and cultural. The Second War transformed Armageddon in ways that were permanent. The decades of continued fighting that followed, Ghazghkull's initial departure, orc forces that had been left behind, continuing their campaign without the Prophet's direction, driven by the biological momentum of a species that does not understand stopping, consumed generations of soldiers and resources that the Imperium needed elsewhere. The land itself changed. Vast regions of Armageddon's surface, once farmland or wilderness or hive city suburbs, became the ash wastes that define the planet's current geography. The population adjusted, developing the particular culture of a place that has known extended conflict and expects more of it. Commissar Yarek's presence there in the years between the Second and Third Wars, his obsessive preparation, his conversion of the lessons of the Second War into defensive doctrine, his cultivation of the officer corps that would lead the Third War's defense, gave Armageddon a military culture that was more sophisticated about orc tactics than almost any other world in the Imperium. When Ghazghkull returned, the planet he attacked was not the same planet he had attacked the first time. It was a world that had spent 5 decades specifically preparing for him. It still almost fell. This tells you something important about the scale of what Ghazghkull brought. The Third War left Armageddon in a state that its own astropaths described, in messages that made their way through the warp to Terra, as a world that was no longer simply a hive world with a military conflict. It had become a permanent war zone, a place where the distinction between military front and civilian space had collapsed entirely, where the industrial output that made the planet strategically valuable was increasingly difficult to sustain, where the population had been reduced by losses that would take generations to recover from if the fighting ever stopped, which, as of the last available intelligence assessments, it had not. The continuing orc presence on Armageddon, the forces Ghazghkull left behind when he departed for his Great Crusade, represents a permanent drain on Imperial resources, not large enough to destabilize the broader strategic situation on its own, but constant grinding. This grinding. Impossible to fully resolve without committing a scale of force that the Imperium cannot afford to commit to a single theater while simultaneously dealing with everything else. This is arguably deliberate, not Ghazghkull's primary intention. The Great Crusade is his primary intention, and Armageddon is, in that context, a theater he left behind rather than a carefully maintained strategic distraction. But the effect of his choices, played out over time, has been to create a wound in the Imperium's side that does not close, a permanent demand on attention and resources, a place where the name of the beast is spoken every day, in command meetings and casualty reports, and the prayers of soldiers who have been stationed there long enough to lose count of how many times they have been in the same stretch of contested ash waste. Expanded. The language of orcs and what it reveals. The orc language is one of those aspects of the setting that is easy to treat as purely comedic. The phonetic spelling, the aggressive simplifications, the vocabulary that seems to consist primarily of variations on hitting things and the things you use to hit them. But orc language, studied carefully, reveals something about the species that the surface presentation obscures. First, orcs have a language, a real language, with grammar and syntax, and a vocabulary broad enough to discuss things that are not fighting. Orc society requires communication about food, shelter, technical matters of engineering and biology, social hierarchy and its navigation, trade, travel, and the various other activities that a complex society requires, even when that society's primary focus is warfare. The language handles all of this. Second, orc language has dialects. Different clans and tribes and regions have developed distinct variations in vocabulary and pronunciation, which is exactly what you would expect from a language that evolved organically over a long period across geographically separated populations. This linguistic diversity is evidence of orc civilizational depth. You cannot have dialects without the historical depth for linguistic drift to occur, and the geographic separation for different populations to develop independently. Third, orc names carry meaning. Ghazghkull's full name, examined carefully, encodes origin, Urk, an element of personal identity, Ghazghkull, which the accounts suggest carries connotations of something like absolute authority, and the word Thraka, which in orc means approximately what we have already said it means: supremacy, dominance, the state of being above all challenge. War bosses across the galaxy have names that similarly encode their aspirations and self-understanding. Grotznik's designation as Mad Doc is a description, yes, but Doc specifically is a word that in orc carries connotations of both medical authority and the particular kind of dangerous expertise that demands respect. The orc word Scumgrod, which describes what Yarrick is to Ghazghkull, does not translate well into human languages, not because it is a simple concept that requires many human words to express, but because it is a genuinely different conceptual category. Human languages have rival, nemesis, archenemy, worthy opponent, all of which describe elements of the relationship. None of them captures the specific combination of respect, affection, anticipation, and the sense that the relationship with this specific person makes you better at being what you are. The orcs have a word for this specific state because their culture, organized as it is around combat, produces this kind of relationship frequently enough that naming it was useful. This tells you something about the depth of orc social and emotional life, that the surface presentation of the species, loud, violent, apparently simple, does not suggest. They have relationships. They have rivalries that go beyond tactical opposition into something more personal. They have preferences for certain kinds of fighting over others, and aesthetic judgments about what constitutes a good fight versus a merely adequate one. Ghazghkull's selection of Yarrick as his Scumgrod, the human being who makes him best, who provides the most satisfying opposition, who he would rather fight than not fight, even though not fighting Yarrick would make certain strategic things easier, is not anomalous orc behavior. It is very typical orc behavior. It is simply being expressed at a scale and with a philosophical clarity that most orcs do not operate at. The orc term for the Divine Crusade, Ghazghkull, is leading, Day Great Green in colloquial usage, with more formal theological terminology available in the frameworks that orc weird boys and warpheads maintain, is similarly rich if you look closely enough. Green in orc cosmology is not simply a color description. It is the orc word for the essential nature of orkiness, the thing that makes an orc, the quality of existence that greenskin beings share. When Ghazghkull speaks of the Great Green coming into the material realm, he is describing something more than just the god's physical manifestation. He is describing the orc species' essential nature, becoming real in the world, becoming undeniable, becoming the fact that the physical universe has to organize itself around, rather than one fact among many competing for dominance. This is profoundly theological in a way that orcs want to fight everything does not capture. It is also, given what the orc collective psychic field actually does and how it interacts with the warp, not as metaphorical as it might appear. Expanded, what the Imperium knows and what it does not know. The Imperium of man's intelligence apparatus regarding Ghazghkull represents, in miniature, a case study in the challenges of gathering and processing information about a genuinely novel kind of threat. The first problem is the warp. Since the Great Rift formed, communication across significant distances requires either physical messengers, which means weeks or months of travel time even for vessels moving through the warp, or astropathic transmission, which is a psychically mediated process that works by having a trained psyker encode a message and transmit it through the warp for another psyker to receive, decode, and pass along. This process is unreliable at the best of times, subject to distortion and interception and simple failure at the transmission or reception end. Since the Great Rift, the warp is measurably more chaotic and more hostile to astropathic transmission, and the error rate has increased in ways that make time-sensitive intelligence essentially impossible to rely on. So, intelligence about Ghazghkull's movements is always old when it arrives, and often wrong, and cannot be checked against other sources in any timely way. By the time an Imperial commander receives a reliable report of Ghazghkull's last confirmed location, that location may have been accurate several months or years ago and meaningless now. The second problem is the nature of what they are trying to track. Orc military movements do not follow the logistics chains and communication protocols and supply requirements that Imperial military movements follow, and that Imperial intelligence is designed to monitor. Orcs do not have standard supply lines. They sustain themselves through whatever the battlefield provides and whatever their biology can synthesize. They do not communicate through channels that Imperial signals intelligence can intercept. Their command and control structure is decentralized enough that following it requires understanding the relationships between individual orcs rather than tracking institutional channels, and that requires cultural intelligence that is rare even within the Ordo Xenos. The third problem is the deliberate misdirection. Ghazghkull has, over the course of his career, demonstrated awareness of the importance of controlling the information available to his opponents. The teleporta attacks on Piscina 4 worked as well as they did, partly because Imperial commanders were planning their responses based on intelligence that told them where the Orc force was, and the force used teleportation to not be where the intelligence said it was. The departure from Armageddon worked as well as it did, because Ghazghkull created a diversion that gave Imperial commanders something to track, while the thing they actually needed to track was already gone. What the Imperium knows about Ghazghkull's current plans amounts to this. He has assembled the largest orc fleet in 8,000 years. He has unified warlords who should not be unified. He is moving through the galaxy on a trajectory, or an absurd trajectory that the Logis Strategos believe is building towards some kind of culminating action, though what action and when in and where are not established. He survived decapitation. He is larger than he was before. He appears to be in multiple places simultaneously, which is either deliberate confusion or something significantly worse. What the Imperium does not know, and what constitutes the heart of the genuine strategic uncertainty, is whether the vision that drives him has a specific timeline. Whether the Ragnarok is something he believes will happen soon, within decades, within centuries. Whether the crusade is in its early stages or approaching some threshold that will trigger the next phase. Whether the god's patience is the god's patience, operating on a timeline that organic minds are not equipped to perceive, or whether Ghazghkull has specific knowledge of a specific event horizon that makes the current moment different in kind from what has come before. The Inquisition, specifically the Ordo Xenos, whose mandate includes the threat that Ghazghkull represents, has devoted significant resources to answering these questions. The interrogation of Makari, the tiny banner-bearer whose testimony provides the narrative frame for the most complete account of Ghazghkull's history, was one such attempt. The data gathered from Makari was extensive and detailed and genuinely valuable, and also did not provide the specific answers the Inquisition most needed, because Makari, for all his closeness to the Prophet, was not privy to the god's plans in a form that could be extracted and weaponized against them. The simple truth is that no one outside Ghazghkull's own consciousness, and possibly Grotznik's, given how much time the mad surgeon spends in close proximity to the Prophet's increasingly mechanical skull, has a complete picture of what the Great Crusade is building toward. And no one inside Ghazghkull's consciousness is in the habit of sharing it with Imperial intelligence services. Expanded, the implications of faith in a universe where gods are real. The 41st millennium is unusual among fictional universes in its treatment of faith and divinity because it takes a position that is genuinely philosophically interesting. The gods are real, their power is real, and this fact does not actually settle any of the most important questions about faith, meaning, or morality. The Emperor exists. He is on the Golden Throne. His influence on the warp is real and measurable and important. And yet none of this tells you what you should do, what kind of person you should be, what the right way to live your life is. The existence of the gods is a fact. What you do with it is still up to you. For Ghazghkull, whose gods are real and whose connection to them appears genuine, this creates a specific theological situation. He is not simply believing in something in the absence of evidence. He has evidence. He has the vision. He has the collective psychic field that changes in quality in ways he can perceive when the crusade moves in alignment with the god's will. He has the survival of Krongar, which he did not engineer. He has a history of events that have consistently moved in the direction the vision described, even when the path was not straight. This makes his faith different in kind from human faith in a universe where the Emperor's divine status is contested, and his direct communication with his followers is essentially impossible. Ghazghkull is not hoping that the gods exist and are guiding him. He experiences guidance. Whatever the philosophical status of that experience, its practical effect is the same: certainty. And certainty, in a universe that has been designed to resist easy answers and to punish simple thinking, is both the most powerful and the most dangerous quality a being can possess. It is powerful because it enables the sustained, patient, directional work that achieves things complexity and ambivalence cannot. It is dangerous because it removes the mechanism of self-correction, the doubt that forces reconsideration, the humility that allows learning, the ability to acknowledge that a path is wrong and change it. Ghazghkull's faith has at least once demonstrably cost him something significant. The Third War for Armageddon, the one Grotznik nudged him toward despite the gods apparently preferring he leave Armageddon alone and pursue the larger mission, was an excursion away from divine purpose, driven by a combination of personal desire and Grotznik's manipulation. The cost was time and focus that could have been spent building the Great Crusade. The benefit was the tactical education of the campaign and the reinforcement of his forces with the experience it provided. Whether the benefit outweighed the cost is the kind of calculation that is difficult to make with certainty, and that Ghazghkull himself apparently wrestled with in the warp-crossed decade between the Third War and Krongar. But he went anyway. Because faith, even the most powerful and well-founded faith, is always in dialogue with desire and with the other creatures who share your life. Grotznik knew how to speak to Ghazghkull's desire for the Armageddon fight in ways that temporarily outweighed the divine instruction toward patience. Makari tried to resist this and was killed for the attempt. Even a prophet can be led away from the vision by someone who knows exactly which thread to pull. This is, in its way, a deeply human moment in a story about an alien being of divine mandate. The gap between what you believe you are supposed to do and what you actually do, influenced by the people around you and the desires within you. It makes Ghazghkull's faith more real, not less. Not a perfect transmission of divine will into unblemished action, but something lived through and sometimes failed and eventually recovered. Something earned. And in that earning, in the long arc of his story from Waste Dump on Urk to the Great Crusade spreading across the galaxy, there is something that the best stories always contain. A character who is genuinely changed by what happens to them, who is not simply executing a predetermined function, but navigating a life that has consequences, that makes demands, that gives and takes in ways that shape who he is and who he will be. Ghazghkull is not a simple villain. He is not a mindless force of destruction, dressed in the convenient costume of green skin and big armor. He is a being of extraordinary faith and extraordinary capacity, doing the thing he was made to do, in a universe that did not stop having genuinely difficult questions just because some of its gods are provably real. The galaxy should be afraid of him. It is right to be afraid. But it should also, in its quieter moments, consider what it says about the nature of purpose and faith and destiny, that the most dangerous being currently walking its battlefields is genuinely, sincerely, absolutely certain that what he is doing is right. That certainty, that faith, that patient, burning, unkillable conviction. That is the most frightening thing about Ghazghkull. Not the size, not the tactical genius, not even the divine mandate or the unkillable body or the fleet of 5 million ships. The certainty. Because the certainty is what makes everything else possible. And the certainty, unlike any of the rest of it, cannot be killed. Closing thoughts. Where the story stands now. Right now, at the moment of this telling, the Great Crusade is ongoing. The galaxy is in a state that military historians will likely, if there are military historians 1,000 years from now, who have access to the records, describe as the most complex simultaneous crisis in the history of the Imperium of Man. The Great Rift continues to divide the galaxy. The reborn Primarch Robute Guilliman leads the Indomitus Crusade in an attempt to stabilize Imperial space across multiple theaters. Chaos incursions pour through the tier in real space, with an intensity that has not been seen since the Horus Heresy. Tyranid hive fleets continue their patient consumption of organic matter across the eastern fringe. The Necron dynasties pursue agendas that human intelligence cannot fully map. The Tau Empire expands. And somewhere in all of this, moving with the patience that divine certainty produces, the largest unified orc force in 8,000 years is building towards something. The question of what that something is. Whether the Ragnarok that Ghazghkull's vision described will come to pass, whether the gods will tear through the veil, whether the galaxy will burn green, is one that the narrative has not yet answered. Perhaps it never will, in the sense of a clean and final answer. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is not a universe that tends toward clean and final answers. It is a universe of ongoing conflict and unresolvable tension, where the question is always how people behave in impossible circumstances, rather than whether those circumstances ever relent. What can be said is that Ghazghkull's existence has already changed the galaxy in ways that are permanent. The 3 wars for Armageddon changed that planet permanently. The formation of the Great Rift, in which Ghazghkull's escape from the Haunted Gulf may have played a role, changed the entire galaxy permanently. The model of Orc organization that he has pioneered, the demonstration that Orc society can sustain unified purpose at a scale and duration that theory said was impossible, changes what future Orc warlords will be able to attempt. Even if Ghazghkull were to die tomorrow, finally and truly, and without any Grotsnike available to perform the necessary reconstruction, even then, the mark he has made would persist. The war bosses who have joined his crusade have seen what unified Orc society looks like at scale. They have experienced the psychic amplification that comes from that unity. They know it is possible. They will not forget. The prophet of Gork and Mork, the beast of Armageddon, the warlord of warlords. Whatever else he is or becomes, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka is already one of the defining figures of the 41st millennium. One of the handful of beings whose existence has genuinely changed the terms on which everyone else must operate. One of those creatures that the universe, in the dark and strange logic of its narrative, seems to produce when the conditions are exactly right and exactly wrong simultaneously. A nobody from a dying world, a bolter shell through the skull, an adamantium plate, and a madman's surgery, and a vision in a waste dump, and everything that came after. The galaxy is not ready for what comes next. It rarely is. But knowing the story, understanding how Ghazghkull became what he became, what drives him, what has failed to stop him, what he believes and why that belief matters, means that when the sky turns green, you at least know what you are looking at, and you know that the being looking back at you has been planning this since before you were born. Sleep well.